Some folks think courage is a loud thing. A drawn pistol, a shout, a man standing tall in the road with his hand hovering over leather. I used to think that too, before the night I'm about to tell you about. Before I watched a woman half the size of the man threatening her set down a whiskey glass so gently it didn't make a sound, and answer him with 6 words that turned a room full of hard men into statues. I've told this story maybe 4 times in the 30 years since. Each time my hands go a little cold at the same part, because I keep expecting, somewhere deep in my chest, that this time it'll end different, that this time he won't stop, that this time she'll be wrong about the one thing she staked all our lives on. She never is, but my hands go cold anyway. My name doesn't matter much for this. I was a ranch hand then, 24 years old and dumb as a fence post, sitting in the corner of the Silver Cup in a town too small to bother nomming on most maps. What matters is her, and what matters is what she knew that none of the rest of us did. Let me take you back to that room. Let me put you in that corner chair beside me, and I'll try to make you feel the quiet the way I felt it. The trouble walked in at 9:15, and I knew it was trouble before the doors stopped swinging. You learn to read a room when you spend your days around skittish cattle and skittish men. There's a rhythm to a saloon on an ordinary night. The clink of glasses, the low mutter of card games, Bud thumping the bad piano key he never fixed because he said the flatness gave the place character. That rhythm broke the second the man stepped through the door, the way a herd goes still when a wolf gets downwind. He was tall, not the kind of tall that folds itself apologetically through doorways, but the kind that owns the space it takes up. Long duster the color of trail dust, a scarf pulled down off a face that hadn't been shaved in a week or maybe a lifetime. And his eyes, I remember his eyes did a slow circuit of the room, cataloging every one of us, deciding in about 2 seconds flat that not a single soul present was worth his concern. I looked down at my drink. So did most everybody. That's the thing folks who tell these stories always get wrong. They make it sound brave, the way a whole saloon goes quiet. It isn't brave. It's the opposite. It's a room full of grown men making themselves small and hopping the danger pick someone else. I heard his boots cross the floor, heard a spur drag with each step, that little metallic whisper, heard him reach the bar and plant one elbow on it and say, in a voice that wasn't loud but carried anyway, "Whiskey." Now behind that bar was where she stood, and here's where I have to stop and tell you about her, because everything that comes after hangs on it. Her name was Della. She'd owned the Silver Cup for going on 6 years by then, since her husband took a fever one winter and didn't come out the other side of it. She was maybe 40. Small, I mean genuinely small. The top of her head wouldn't have cleared that man's shoulder. She wore her gray-threaded hair pinned up plain, and she had this habit of drying a glass with a rag whether the glass needed drying or not. Something to do with her hands, I always figured. She kept a shotgun under the bar the same as any saloon owner did, but in 6 years I'd never once seen her reach for it. Never needed to. She ran that place with a quiet that people mistook for softness right up until they tested it. She didn't reach for the shotgun now, either. She set down the glass she was drying, poured 2 fingers of whiskey, not rushed, not slow, just even, and slid it across the bar to him. And she said, "That'll be 2 bits." He didn't touch the money he hadn't offered. He drank the whiskey in one motion, set the glass down, and studied her over the rim of it. "You know who I am," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've got a guess," Della said. "Then you know I don't pay 2 bits for whiskey in a town like this." He smiled, and it was an ugly thing, that smile, all confidence and no warmth. "I don't pay for much of anything, I take it. And what I'm taking tonight is whatever's in that lockbox you keep in the back, and then I'm taking my time deciding what else this town owes me." He leaned in. "So why don't you go fetch it, little lady, before I lose the good mood I rode in with?" I want you to understand the silence that followed. It wasn't the silence of people watching a show. It was the silence of 11 men doing arithmetic, and every one of them arriving at the same sum. Not my fight, not my money, not my life. I did that arithmetic too. God forgive me, I sat in my corner and I did it, and I came out the same coward's answer as everyone else. Della picked up another glass, started drying it. "You're going to want to leave," she said. The man laughed, actually laughed a short bark of it. "Am I?" "You are." She set the glass down, picked up the next one. "Because I know something you don't, and by the time you figure it out, it's going to be too late for you to do anything smart about it." Something flickered across his face. Not fear, a man like that doesn't come preloaded with fear, but a kind of irritation, the way you'd feel if a barn cat hissed at you. He straightened up off the bar. His hand drifted, casual as anything, toward the pistol on his hip. "Lady," he said, "I have killed men for less mouth than you've given me in the last minute. So I'm going to ask you one time, real polite, to tell me exactly what it is you think you know. And then I'm going to decide whether you get to keep breathing while I clean out your safe." And Della, small Della, 40-year-old widow Della who dried glasses to keep her hands busy, looked up at him. She wasn't drying a glass anymore. Both her hands were flat on the bar, and I realized with a lurch in my gut that I couldn't see one of them clearly, that the angle of her shoulder was just slightly wrong, that she'd been positioning herself, slow and patient, through this whole conversation, the way she'd position herself to reach something on a low shelf. "Here's what I know," she said, quiet, even. "My husband built this place. He also built the town's first jail and the assay office and the church, and he was friends with every man who mattered from here to the territory line. And when he died, those men came to me and they said, 'Della, anything you need, anything at all, you are not alone.'" She let that sit. "You rode in here thinking this was a town too small to protect itself, too small to matter, and you're half right, it is small." She leaned forward now, just an inch, and her voice dropped, and I swear to you every man in that room stopped breathing to hear it. "But small towns remember their dead, and there are 6 men within the sound of my voice right now who owe my husband their lives, their livelihoods, or their land. You've had your back to the door this whole time. You never once counted us." I felt it then, the shift, felt it move through that room like a current through water, because she was right. She'd known exactly what she was doing. She'd kept him talking, kept his attention pinned on her, on the smallness of her, while the arithmetic in 11 men's heads slowly changed its answer. "Not my fight" became something else. The man's hand was still near his pistol, but he'd gone very still now, and I watched his eyes do that circuit of the room again, and this time they counted. This time he saw old Prout by the stove, who'd gone quiet and set down his cards. Saw the Hendricks brothers at the far table, both of them turned in their chairs. Saw me, even in my corner, and I'll be honest, I don't know what he saw in my face, but I felt something harden in it that I hadn't put there on purpose. "You're bluffing," he said, but the confidence had gone thin. "Maybe," Della said. "You want to bet your life on maybe, because here's the last thing I know and then I'm done talking." Her hand, the one I couldn't see, came up level over the edge of the bar, and there was the shotgun after all, and it was pointed at his belt buckle from 3 feet away. "The first sound you hear won't be mine. Mine'll be the second one. You won't have time to be surprised by either." The clock on the wall had a tick to it I'd never noticed before that night. I noticed it now. It filled the whole room. Nobody moved. The man's eyes went from Della's face to the shotgun to the room and back to Della's face, and I could see him running it, the way a gambler runs a bad hand looking for the play that isn't there. 6 men, maybe more. A shotgun 3 feet from his gut. A door at his back he'd stopped being able to see. "You'd die too," he said. "Buckshot that close, you'd catch it same as me." "I'm a widow with no children and a bad hip," Della said. "You really think you found the one person in this room most afraid of dying?" And that was the answer that silenced every man in the saloon. Not a threat. A truth, laid down flat and plain, that took the one card he had left and turned it into nothing. Because he'd built his whole life on the idea that everyone wanted to live more than they wanted to stop him. And she just told him, calm as still water, that she was the exception, that he'd walked into the one saloon in the territory owned by someone with nothing left to lose and every reason to make a stand of it. I have thought about that moment for 30 years. I have thought about what it costs a person to be able to say a thing like that and mean it. To have arrived, through grief and loneliness and 6 hard years of running a business alone in a town of men who mostly saw a small, tired woman, to have arrived at a place where death held no threat over you. It's not courage the way I thought courage was, back when I was 24 and dumb as a fence post. It's something quieter and sadder and far, far stronger. The man took his hand off his pistol. He did it slow. He set both hands flat on the bar, mirroring her, and for a long moment the two of them just looked at each other, and something passed between them that I didn't understand then and only half understand now. Some recognition, like two people who'd each looked at the bottom of the same well and were surprised to find someone else down there. "The whiskey," he said finally. His voice had changed. "What do I owe you?" "2 bits," Della said. He put a coin on the bar. Not 2 bits. A whole dollar gold that rang when it landed. Then he turned his back on that shotgun, which took its own kind of nerve, and he walked toward the door. And old Prout, God bless his cussed heart, called out after him, "You forgot your change." The man stopped. His shoulders moved, and it took me a second to understand he was laughing, silent and surprised, like the sound had rusted shut in him years ago and Prout had knocked it loose. "Keep it," he said, and he pushed through the doors into the dark, and the spurs whispered away down the street, and we heard a horse, and then we heard nothing at all. Nobody spoke for a good while. Then Bud, behind the piano, hit that flat key, on purpose, I think, and the room let out a breath it had been holding for what felt like a year, and somebody laughed too loud and somebody else's chair scraped, and just like that the rhythm came back. The clink of glasses, the mutter of cards, life, rushing back in to fill the space where death had been standing a minute before. But I sat in my corner and I watched Della. She set the shotgun down, and I saw I was close enough to see that her hands had started shaking. Now, only now with it over. She picked up a glass and a rag and she started drying it, and the shaking was bad enough that the rag made a small, frantic sound against the glass, and she kept her eyes down so nobody would see, and I understood then that she'd been just as afraid as any of us the whole time. She just decided that being afraid wasn't the same as being helpless. That was the whole of it. That was the thing she knew that none of us did. I got up, crossed the room. I didn't have any words worth saying, so I just set my empty glass on the bar and put a coin beside it, and I said, "Another when your hands are steady." She looked up at me, and she smiled, small, tired, real, and she said, "They're steady enough." They weren't, but she poured it anyway and only spilled a little, and neither of us said anything about the wet ring it left on the wood. What I didn't know that night, what none of us knew, was that the man in the duster would come back to that town. Not the way you're thinking. Not for revenge, and not for the lockbox. He'd come back the next spring on a gray morning, and he'd have something with him that would explain the well he'd looked down, and the recognition that had passed between them, and why a dollar and not 2 bits. He came back in the spring, the way I told you. But before I put you on that gray morning and let you watch him ride in, I have to back up and tell you what the winter did to me. Because a story isn't only what happens. It's who's standing there when it happens, and how much they've got left to feel it with. That winter was a hard one. We lost cattle to the cold and lost 2 men off the Hendricks spread to a bad crossing, and I spent most of December and January with my hands cracked open from the wind and my head full of the thing I'd seen in the silver cup. I couldn't shake it. I'd be mending fence in a field white to the horizon, and I'd hear it again. "You really think you found the one person in this room most afraid of dying?" And I'd have to stop and stand there a while. I'd started keeping a log by then. Little leather book I bought off a peddler, meant it for tracking stock, mostly ended up putting other things in it. Things I couldn't say out loud to the men I worked with who'd have looked at me sideways. I wrote about that night maybe a dozen times over that winter, trying to get it right, trying to figure out why it wouldn't let me go. I've still got the book. The handwriting gets worse as the pages go on from the cold and from writing by candle, but I can still read the line I kept coming back to. She wasn't brave. She was done. And done is stronger than brave. I didn't fully understand what I meant by that until the spring. Until he came back and I found out what Dunn had cost her, and what it had cost him, and how the two of them had arrived at the same terrible place by two different roads. He rode in on a gray morning in April, the kind where the sky can't decide on rain, and the mud sucked at his horse's hooves the whole way down the main street. I was outside the mercantile loading feed when I saw him, and I'll tell you my whole body went cold and stupid at once. Same duster. Same slow way of owning the space around him. I dropped a sack of feed and didn't even feel it hit my boot. But something was wrong with the picture, and it took me a second to place it. He was leading a second horse, and across the second horse's saddle, wrapped in canvas and roped down careful, was a shape I didn't want to name but named anyway, because I'd loaded enough of them off that bad crossing in January to know the shape of a body when I saw one. He rode straight to the Silver Cup, tied both horses, and he stood there in the mud a moment, looking at the doors, and I watched a man who'd faced down a shotgun without blinking stand frozen at the threshold of a saloon like it was the hardest thing he'd done in his life. Then he went in, and God help me, I dropped everything and followed because I had to know, and I wasn't the only one. By the time I got through the doors, there were 4 or 5 of us crowding in behind him, drawn by the same awful curiosity. Della was behind the bar, of course she was, drying a glass. She saw him and went still, and I watched her recognize him, watched the memory of that November night cross her face, and I saw her hand start to drift toward where the shotgun lived. But then she saw his face, and she stopped. Because he was crying. This big hard killer of a man, standing in the doorway of a saloon in a nothing town, with tears cutting clean lines down a face that hadn't seen a razor in longer than last time. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there and leaked grief like a man who'd forgotten he still could, and didn't know how to stop now that he'd started. "I need your help," he said. "I don't have anyone else to ask. And you're the only person I've met in 10 years who wasn't afraid of me, so I figured you might be the only one who'd listen instead of running." Della set down the glass. "Who's on the horse?" she said, not unkind, just direct the way she was. "My sister." His voice broke on the word and he had to stop and put himself back together before he could go on. "Her name was Ruth. She was all I had. And I couldn't." He stopped again. "I've been carrying her 4 days. I don't know where to put her down. I don't know how to. I've buried men I killed and never thought twice, and I can't figure out how to bury the one person I ever." He couldn't finish it. He just stood there coming apart. And Della came out from behind that bar. I'd never seen her do it in all the years I'd been drinking in her place. She came around the end of the bar and she crossed the floor to this man who'd threatened her life 5 months before. This outlaw the whole territory was afraid of, and she was so small next to him, and she reached up and put one hand flat on his chest. Just held it there. The way you'd calm a spooked animal. The way you'd tell someone without words, "I've got you. You can stop holding it up now." "Sit down," she said. "I'll pour you something, and you're going to tell me about Ruth." Here's what came out over the next hour in pieces, with long silences in between. His name was Cole. The last name doesn't matter, and I never wrote it down on purpose. He and Ruth had been orphaned young, and he'd done bad things to keep the two of them fed started young, the way those things start, one desperate choice at a time until the choices stop feeling like choices and just feel like who you are. Ruth had gotten out. He'd made sure of it. Sent her money he never told her where it came from, set her up in a proper town 2 territories over, let her believe he was a cattle buyer who traveled a lot. She'd married, had a little girl. And then the fever came through, the same kind that took Della's husband, the same kind that takes and doesn't care who's good and who's bad. Ruth's husband first, then Ruth. The little girl was with a neighbor woman now, waiting, and Ruth, at the end, with the last of what she had had made Cole promise two things. The first was to bury her somewhere green, not the dry hardpan where they'd grown up, somewhere with grass and water and shade, the kind of place they'd dreamed about as hungry children and never once seen. The second was to raise her daughter, to stop, to be, for this one small person, the man he'd pretended to be all those years in his letters. I don't know how, Cole said. He had his hands wrapped around the glass Dell'd poured him and he hadn't drunk from it. I don't know how to be that. I've been the other thing so long I don't think there's anything else left in me. And that little girl she deserves somebody who isn't. He shook his head. I keep thinking the kindest thing I could do is leave her with the neighbor and ride off. She'd be better off never knowing what her uncle is. And that's when Della said the second thing I've carried 30 years. She'd been quiet, listening, drying the same glass over and over the way she did. And now she set it down and she looked at him and she said, "You want to know the most dangerous lie I ever believed? It's that people don't change. I told myself that after my husband died. Told myself I was one thing now, a widow, small and finished, waiting to get old. I believed it so hard I nearly became it." She leaned on the bar. "Then a man walked into my saloon with a gun and I found out I was somebody else entirely. Somebody I'd never have met if he hadn't forced me to. You met her too. You remember what she said to you?" Cole almost smiled. "I remember. That woman wasn't there in the morning. She wasn't there the day before. She showed up because she had to, and once I'd met her I couldn't unmeet her. That's how it works. You don't change all at once. You just get put in a place where the old you can't survive, and you find out what else you've got." She nodded toward the door, toward the horses, toward the little girl waiting 2 territories away. "That child is going to put you in that place every single day. And you're going to hate it and it's going to break you open and you are going to become somebody you have never met. I can't promise you'll like him, but I can promise he's in there. I've got no doubt at all." The room was quiet. That same quiet from November, but turned all the way around. Not the quiet of men waiting to see who dies, but the quiet of men watching something get born. "Why," Cole said, "why would you help me? I threatened to kill you." "You did," Della agreed. "And then you looked down the same well I've been living at the bottom of and I watched you recognize it. Nobody who's really seen that place can walk past somebody else stuck in it. Not once they know." She picked her glass back up. "Besides, my husband built the church out back. I imagine it's got room for one more good woman in the ground behind it and one more lost soul kneeling in front. We buried Ruth 2 days later, behind the little white church her kind of stranger had built, in the greenest patch of ground for 40 miles, under a cottonwood just starting to leaf out. The whole town came. I don't fully know why most of them had never met her, and they knew exactly what her brother was. But I think that November night had done something to us. I think a town that's watched a small woman refuse to be afraid comes out the other side a little braver than it went in. A little more willing to stand next to a grieving killer at a graveside and call it the right thing to do." Cole didn't ride off after. He fetched the little girl, brought her back to our nothing town, which I suppose isn't a nothing town anymore, not to me. He bought a small piece of land off the Hendricks brothers and he learned to ranch it, badly at first and then less badly, and I'd see him at the Silver Cup now and again, never drinking much, always leaving $1 for 2 bits worth of whiskey. The girl grew up wild and happy and unafraid of anything, the way children raised by people who have decided to be brave for them tend to grow. She called Della Aunt, though there was no blood in it. And Cole, the man who told us there was nothing else left in him, turned out to be wrong about that, the way most of us are wrong about the worst things we believe about ourselves. I asked him once years later what changed him, expected him to say the girl, or Ruth, or grief. He thought about it a long while. Then he said, "A woman set down a glass of whiskey and told me she wasn't afraid to die, and I realized I'd spent my whole life being the scariest thing in every room I walked into, and it hadn't made me one bit less afraid of anything." He turned his glass on the bar, that same restless habit Della had. She had it backwards from me, and she'd ended up somewhere I wanted to be. So I figured I'd try walking her direction instead of mine, see where it went. Della died some years back now. Old in her bed with that girl grown by then, with children of her own holding her hand. The whole town turned out for that one too, and they buried her behind the church, not far from Ruth, under a cottonwood that had grown tall enough by then to throw real shade. I keep the leather log still. I added to it the day of her funeral, wrote down the two things she said that I've carried all these years so they wouldn't go in the ground with the rest of what I remember. Done is stronger than brave, and you don't change all at once, you just get put somewhere the old you can't survive. I'm an old man now myself, older than she was that November night, older than I ever figured I'd get, and I still don't have her nerve, not really. I still do the coward's arithmetic sometimes, God help me. But every now and again I catch myself in a hard moment, and I hear that flat, even voice, and I set down whatever's shaking in my hands and I stand up a little straighter than I mean to. She never knew what she started that night she answered an outlaw. Or maybe she did. Maybe that was the last thing she knew that the rest of us didn't. I never did ask her. I wish I had.